Did you know that a single clause in the home buying contract can be the difference between buying your dream home and a real estate nightmare? In today's video, we're going to dive into the world of contingencies when it comes to buying a home. These little known contract clauses play a huge role in protecting you as a buyer, also a seller in many cases, but can also be a stumbling block if you don't fully understand them, and you have to be careful when you're signing your original contract. But with that, we're going to talk about the most common contingencies in a real estate purchase agreement. We'll decode how they work, and we'll also address some commonly asked questions when it comes to contingencies and buying a home. Whether you're a first-time home buyer, someone that's purchased many homes, understanding these contingencies can save you time, can save you money, and also a lot of headaches. So with that, keep watching to unlock the secrets of navigating home buying contingencies like a pro. So with that, I want to start today's video by talking about contingencies, what they are, because that's a common question that comes up when people are looking to buy a house. What is a contingency? A contingency is essentially an escape clause when it comes to buying a contract. So it's kind of a if-then type of scenario. So when it comes to buying a house, one of the contingencies, for example, is an appraisal contingency. So if that appraisal comes in at value, then essentially you've met that contingency and you would more or less proceed along with the contract. But it could go the other scenario. If that appraisal came in less than expected, then you have the opportunity to renegotiate in some cases, assuming you have that contingency in place. And that's exactly what we're going to dive into in today's video. We're going to go over all of these contingencies, help you understand what they mean so that you can navigate the home buying process without having reservations about contingencies. But before we do that, I'd like to take a minute and ask a favor. If you find any value in my videos at all, do me a favor and hit that thumbs up. Also, subscribe to the channel to stay updated on everything real estate related. So why are there actually contingencies when it comes to buying a home? Well, the contingency there is to protect the buyer from having to move forward with a contract when certain things aren't met, if you will. And we'll talk about those certain things here in just a minute. And in some cases, they can be there to protect the seller. Maybe the seller has to find a replacement home before they'll actually sell their current residence, the one that we're talking about here. Well, that contingency gives them the opportunity that if they don't find that replacement home, then they may not have to sell this current residence. That way they're not homeless when putting their home on the market. And we'll talk about that here in just a minute. But let's talk about the basic contingencies when it comes to buying a home, because these are the contingencies that are going to show up in most residential purchase agreements. Now, something to understand, I'm located here in Southern California, so we use the California residential purchase agreement. It's for all of California. Now, if you're in a different state, the contingencies might be a little bit different than they are here in California. In fact, the timelines might be a little bit different than here in California, but I'm going to give you an example based on my residential purchase agreement. And then if you're in another state, you can ask questions to your real estate professional about these things if the timelines vary or the contingencies vary, just to make sure you fully understand. Now, before we talk about specific contingencies, let's talk about how contingencies affect the home buying process. Now, contingencies are written into the contract. They're part of the boilerplated document, if you will. They're already in there. It's just a matter of you as a buyer deciding if those are the time frames that you want to abide by when buying a home. Now, for California, our purchase agreement essentially gives you 17 days to do your due diligence on the property to decide whether or not you want to move forward with purchasing that home. Now, when it comes to the home buying process and the negotiation process, sometimes the other side, the listing agent, the seller, can reduce these contingencies or in some case waive them depending on how you've written the contract. And that's why it's super, super important that you fully understand what these contingencies are and what you're signing so that you're not putting yourself at risk of losing your deposit. And that's something very, very important to note. Here in the state of California, these contingencies essentially protect your earnest money that's being held with the escrow company. So when you decide to buy a home, typically you're putting an escrow deposit down, an earnest money deposit that shows good faith when buying a home. And over the last couple of years, it's been pretty standard here in the state of California that you offer 3% of the purchase price to go into escrow to show good faith of part of this earnest money. So let's say, for example, you're buying a $500,000 home. That essentially means you're putting $15,000 of your hard-earned money into escrow. Now, this money can go towards your down payment. It can go towards your closing costs. It's not in addition to, but it's money that has to come out of your pocket, out of your checking savings account initially to go sit into an escrow company. And the contingencies that we're going to talk about in today's video essentially protect that money. So as long as you have contingencies in place, in theory, your earnest money isn't at risk. But at which point you release the contingencies when buying a home, that's when you put that money at risk. That's when the seller can essentially take your earnest money deposit. That's why it's super, super important to fully understand what these contingencies are, what they protect, and what you're signing when you're going through the process. Now, over the last couple of years, a lot of buyers have waived contingencies. They've gone into the process saying, I don't need a home inspection. I don't need an appraisal. I'm willing to waive those contingencies. And in some cases, they said, I'll waive all contingencies because we really, really want this home. Because competition's crazy, we're not willing to risk losing it. We're willing to waive everything, which in theory means that your earnest money deposit is at risk from day one. And that's something you absolutely want to avoid in most scenarios when buying a home. Now, you might be watching this going, Jeb, why would people waive all of their contingencies? Well, it can often be done to make your offer more appealing to the seller. If you think of competition, if there's 4 or 5 offers on a property and everyone has contingencies in place and everyone's somewhere around the same offering price, what can you do to help your offer stand out? Well, in some cases, you can shorten these contingency timeframes to give you less time to complete your due diligence, or you might be really, really brave or getting really bad advice from a real estate agent saying you need to waive all of these in order to help your offer stand out. So that's why it's imperative to know exactly what you're signing before releasing these contingencies, because you could be putting your money at risk. So in today's video, let's start with one of the very basic contingencies it comes when buying a house, and that is the appraisal contingency. Now, for many people out there, they fully understand this, while others don't really understand what they're signing. The appraisal contingency essentially is in place to protect you from having to buy a home that doesn't come in at value. So let's say, for example, you're buying a home that's $500,000. Well, if the appraisal contingency is in place and that home does not appraise for $500,000, let's say it appraises for $450,000, and the seller isn't willing to renegotiate with you, or in some cases you might not want to move forward even if the seller is willing to negotiate. Well, that appraisal contingency essentially gives you the right to back out of that contract because the appraisal didn't come in at value. Now, something to also understand, this is often misunderstood. Sometimes you'll waive that appraisal contingency, because I've had clients do it many, many times. We know the value is going to come in based on comparable, so we waive that appraisal contingency. Well, oftentimes buyers say, well, I've waived the appraisal contingency. Why is the lender still requiring me to do an appraisal? Because the lender is going to require the appraisal. What you're saying is, I don't care where that value comes in. I'm willing to buy that home whether it appraises or not. So in the case that you waive your appraisal contingency, there's still a really high likelihood that the lender is going to require an appraisal, because the lender wants to know that the value of the home is actually there, regardless of whether you decide to waive it or not. Now, something I want to point out here, because this is often given as advice by real estate agents, and it's completely unethical and not something I agree with, but they say, hey, waive the appraisal contingency to make your offer stand out. But if the appraisal doesn't come in, what we'll do is we'll use another contingency in the contract to back out of the contract, and therefore your offer looks stronger up front. But if it doesn't come into value, we can still back out and move forward. Understand? That's unethical and could end up putting you at risk of losing your deposit. So just make sure you understand when you're waiving contingencies or releasing contingencies, what you're releasing, so that you're not putting yourself in one of these bad positions. Now, the second contingency we're going to talk about today is the inspection contingency. Now, this is typically known as a home inspection contingency, but during this inspection contingency, you can also do other inspections outside of, say, a basic home inspection. You might do a mold inspection, you might do a sewer inspection, you might do any sort of inspection during this home inspection period as part of your due diligence. Now, the way the California Residential Purchase Agreement is written is that it gives you 17 days to go through all of your due diligence on all the contingencies we're going to talk about today in order to determine whether or not you want to proceed forward. So during this time frame, you're going to have your appraisal contingency done, you're going to have your home inspection contingency done. Now, the way the home inspection works is you're going to get this home inspection completed, and chances are that home inspector is going to come back with a laundry list of items that come up in that inspection. Now, some of these items might be serious items. Some of them are going to be health and safety items. Some might be code changes over time. But in my experience, most of the time, the things that show up in the inspection report are relatively minor items on a big scale of things. But this inspection contingency gives you the opportunity to decide whether or not you want to move forward based on what comes back in that inspection. So say the inspection comes back with a ton of items. You can look at all of that stuff and say, you know what, this is way too much for me. It's completely overwhelming. This house needs way too much work. We're not moving forward. Or as part of your inspection contingency, you can request the seller to do repairs. You can ask them to fix items. You can ask for a credit for money to fix items, or you might renegotiate the price or do something else during this inspection period. But essentially, this inspection period gives you the opportunity to do the inspection and then start that request or start that negotiation to try to get these repairs remedied in whatever manner that you decide. But assuming you waive that contingency from the start, which some people decide to do, hey, I don't need a home inspection contingency. I don't need an appraisal contingency. We're waiving them. Well, that doesn't mean you can't actually do an inspection. It just means that you can't use that inspection and or in this case, the appraisal to back out of the contract. You have to use something else. But just like I said a moment ago with the appraisal, but if you waive your inspection contingency and then you're using something else to back out because something came back in the inspection that you didn't like, well, depending on the scenario, in some cases that seller might push, especially if they know that you used the inspection to back out after you waived it, and you could put your risk at deposit. So just make sure if you're waiving a contingency, you're not trying to get around it by using another contingency to back out if something happens with that contingency. And the same can be said for the third contingency that we're going to talk about in today's video, and that's the loan contingency. So the loan contingency works a lot like the last two contingencies, which essentially means if your loan isn't approved by the lender, then essentially you don't have to proceed forward with buying that home. Now, some states, I know that the contract is written differently in order to protect the seller in some cases. Maybe some of your earnest money deposit is non-refundable from the time you start that contract. But here in the state of California, remember, your deposit is never at risk until you release all these contingencies. That's why the more contingencies you have in place, in theory, the more protection you have when it comes to buying a home. Now, you might be watching this going, Jeb, why would I need a loan contingency if I went through the pre-approval process and I was pre-approved? Well, it's because what happens during the pre-approval process is a lender approves you based on the documentation that you submitted, but oftentimes they're kind of a middleman in between you and the actual lender, the bank that's doing the loan. So what happens is they submit the loan to an underwriter. The underwriter essentially dots the I's, crosses the T's with all the information that is submitted along with the documentation from buying the home, the purchase contract, the title report, the appraisal, all of this stuff, and says, yeah, you're good to go. Well, in the case they say, no, you're not good to go. Your credit score doesn't meet the requirements. The income was calculated incorrectly. You're not really in a position to proceed forward. Well, as long as you have that loan contingency in place, then in theory, you can use that to back out of the contract. Now, something I want to point out is oftentimes the loan will go to an underwriter and the loan will be approved, but there's still conditions on that loan. That's typically how loans work. It's approved, and then there's some conditions that you need to satisfy in order to get to the next stage of that contract. Well, oftentimes sellers representing buyers and or buyers think that until their loan is fully at loan docs, that they can keep that contingency in place. And that's not how it works. Typically, once your loan is approved with that lender, then you've met that loan contingency guideline, and then you can release that time frame. Now, if you have additional days left on your loan contingency, then you can allow that lender to still proceed through that loan process. But oftentimes what will happen is it's day 17, it's time to release your loan contingency, and your loan's approved, and the buyer's unwilling to release that contingency, or the selling agent is telling the buyer, hey, don't release that contingency yet because you still have some conditions to satisfy. And that's what we're going to talk about here in just a minute when we talk about the question of what happens if a contingency isn't met. So hold on to that thought here and we'll address it in just a moment. Now understand the first three contingencies that I just talked about, the appraisal, the home inspection, and the loan, are the most important in my opinion because they are where most deals fall apart when it comes to the home buying process. Now that doesn't mean the other ones can't cause issues as well, but in 20 years of selling real estate, I would say those top three there are the reasons that most deals fall out of contract. But some of the other contingencies that you have as a home buyer are if you're buying a property that's in an HOA that has a homeowners association. Condos typically have an HOA, townhomes typically have some sort of HOA. Oftentimes you can have a planned community that has a homeowners association. Now with this homeowners association, you have architectural guidelines, you have reserve studies, you have minutes, you have all of these documents, the CC&Rs that the buyer gets to review review in order to decide whether or not they want to move forward. Now, more often than not, these aren't an issue, but sometimes there are pet restrictions within these documents. Sometimes there are architectural guidelines that you can't do to your property that you might not be happy with. Or sometimes maybe the community doesn't have proper reserves within their budget. Maybe their budget is crazy and you look at it and you go, this is nuts. This community doesn't have any money. We're not moving forward. Well, all of these things give you an opportunity to back out as long as you have them in place. So by now you should understand why contingencies are important and why you should have them in place. Because if you waive them and something comes back in one of the things that we've talked about, you don't really have that escape clause to be able to back out of the contract. So the more contingencies you have in place, like I said, the more opportunities or the more items you have to satisfy before releasing that earnest money deposit. So in addition to the HOA documents, you have seller disclosures. Now, I'm not sure how this works in other states, but here in the state of California, the sellers are required to sign certain disclosures, and some of those disclosures ask specific questions about that property. Some of those questions might be, has someone passed away in the property in the last 3 years? Or are there any insurance claims affecting the property? Things like that. And the seller is required to fill out these documents to the best of their ability, which means if there's something that they're aware of, they should be disclosing it. And as a buyer, you get an opportunity to review these documents. Now, I would say more often than not, nothing comes up. Sometimes these documents can create additional questions that the buyer might have, and then go back to the seller to ask for additional information. So as long as you have this contingency in place, you get the opportunity to review these disclosures. Now, another contingency that comes up is reviewing the preliminary title report. So the title report, just to make sure there's nothing that's affecting the title of this property. Now, typically speaking, a lender is not going to lend on a property that has existing liens or existing judgments or anything like that on the property. So most of that stuff is going to be taken care of prior to you buying a home, but there might be easements. There might be something on the property that you're not aware of that might show up in that title report. Now, out of all the contingencies that we've been through, I would say that this item is probably at the bottom of the list when it comes to something that's really going to affect you from buying a home or not, at least in my experience, but it's something you get an opportunity to review. And the last contingency we're going to talk about today is maybe you have a contingency or the seller has a contingency from buying a home while selling another home. So maybe you're a buyer and you have to sell your home before you can buy this home. Well, there's probably a contingency that says, hey, I have this property over here listed on the market, and unless that property closes, I'm not in a position to buy this home. So for example, I recently just sold my home to buy another home. When the buyer came to buy my home, I put a stipulation in the contract that said, hey, I'm not required to sell you my home unless the home that I'm purchasing actually works out. And then on the flip side, the home that I was purchasing, I had an agreement with that seller also in writing that basically said, hey, I don't have to purchase your home unless the buyer on my home proceeds forward. That way, I'm not at risk of losing my deposit if the buyer backs out. I'm not at the risk of having to sell my home to the buyer if something happens with the up leg of buying that home. So the contingency of selling or buying a home could be something you're having to deal with. And it's something that it's super, super important that you understand as a buyer, because if the seller has a contingency in place that, hey, if my up leg doesn't work, I'm not required to sell you my home. Well, that could put you in a position as a buyer where maybe you've already sold your home and you need to find a new place to rent or a new home to buy. Or maybe you've spent money on inspections and appraisals and that sort of thing, and then that deal doesn't work out. Well, you've lost that money. So just make sure as a buyer, you fully understand all of the things that you're signing. Ask questions to your real estate professional and have them break it down in a way that you can understand. That way you're not putting your money at risk and creating potential nightmares when it comes to buying a home. Now, one of the questions that comes up when we talk about contingencies is, can you waive contingencies? Yes, you can absolutely waive contingencies. In fact, I have buyers waive contingencies all the time. I don't think waiving contingencies is necessarily the problem. The problem is when you waive all of your contingencies, because then you're essentially putting yourself at risk that if you don't move forward with that property, you're losing your deposit, even if something comes up. So I would just be careful if you're thinking about waiving contingencies. I know in competitive markets and in competitive times, it's one of the things that is recommended to you to waive contingencies. But just understand when you're waiving them, you know what you're getting into. Now, I think it's okay to waive appraisal contingencies when you think the property might appraise, but have your real estate professional provide comps. Have them give you an idea of where they think that value is going to come in. And there's no guarantees that it does, but just to base that information off of. And the same can be said for a loan. I trust my lender 100%. When he tells me that a buyer is going to be good to go, that there's not going to be issues based on their credit score, their income, that sort of thing, they can waive their loan contingency, well, then I trust him. I've been using him for nearly 15 years, so I believe what he says. But as a buyer, you have to understand what you're signing, but you also need to trust your real estate professional. Now, if you're watching this and you don't have a lender you can trust, don't have a real estate professional you can trust, there's actually a link in the description below of people that I know, like, and trust that can guide you through that process who do business like I do. So if you're going through the home buying process and you need a referral, do me a favor and check that link. Now, another question that comes up is, how long do contingencies last? Well, in California, like I mentioned several times, 17 days is the contingency period. Now, say for example, you shorten some of these contingencies. That's something that my clients do often per my recommendation when buying a home. Now, the reason we shorten them is to make our offer look a little bit more competitive. Maybe we'll waive the loan contingency because we trust the lender. They think it's going to not be an issue. So we waive that loan contingency, but we have our other contingencies in place. Well, they're 17 days. But I know my inspector can get out there within 2 or 3 days to inspect that property. I also know that based on my conversation with the lender, they can get the appraisal ordered within 2 to 3 days. So what we might do is we might say, hey, instead of 17 days, we're writing our offer to release our contingencies within 10 days because we believe we can get everything done within 10 days to move forward. So in the case that that happens and gets accepted, then you have 10 days to do your due diligence instead of 17. But what happens if you get to day 10 and you haven't released a contingency, for example? Let's say you're still waiting on the appraisal to come back. Well, what I would say is that the seller can, in theory, give you a notice to perform. Now, here in the state of California, the way the contract's written, unless it's altered, is that you have 2 days once that notice to perform is issued to release that contingency, which if it was on day 10, for example, you have until day 12 to release that contingency. And if you don't, then the seller has the opportunity to back out. You don't lose your deposit just because the seller is pushing you to release it. You have to actually sign a document releasing that contingency. So your deposit is never really at risk until you sign the release of all your contingencies. Now, anytime you sign that full release of contingencies, then that's when your deposit is at risk and in theory becomes the seller's money. That's why it's super, super important to know up front, to have a really, really good idea of how long these contingencies are going to take so that you're not being overly optimistic by shortening the contingencies and then not able to perform. But on that same note, what I would say is, as a buyer, as a buyer's agent that represents buyers all the time, if you know that you're getting close to those contingency periods and you haven't released them, if you're just honest up front with the agent on the other side, if you communicate exactly what's going on, oftentimes they'll give you a couple more days in order to extend those contingencies so that it's not really an issue. I would say in 20 years of selling real estate, I've never really had a deal fall apart because contingencies weren't met. So it really shouldn't be an issue in most cases. And also something to keep in mind, if the seller is causing the delay for whatever reason, say you're waiting on the seller disclosure so that you can review them and you're at day 17 and you haven't received them, well, you're not obligated at that point to release contingencies. They haven't actually fulfilled their side of the contract. So even once they provide those documents, there's allotted time in the contract for you to be able to review them. So say, for example, you get the HOA docs on day 16. Well, the way the contract's written is, I believe you have 7 days to review those documents before you actually have to release that contingency, which would push your contingency out even further. So as I've mentioned several times, it's super important to understand what you're signing so that you're not putting yourself at risk. If you have questions, ask your real estate agent. If they can't answer them, then you probably need to find a new real estate agent, in all honesty. But your agent should be able to guide you through this process. Now, if you're a first-time home buyer and you have additional questions outside of contingencies, you really don't know the process at all, well, I created a first-time home buyer course to take you from A to Z. We talk about things like contingencies, everything when it comes to writing an offer, getting a mortgage, the full process of how to negotiate everything that you need to know. So if that's of interest to you and you want to really know the process, there's a link for the course in the description below. Now, I know contingencies can be a scary thing because it does put your earnest money at risk, potentially losing that money. And for many people, that's a lot of money out there. Now, I've had buyers completely walk away from the deposit and decide not to purchase because they released their contingency, something happened in their life, they got cold feet, whatever. They said, you know what, I'll just give up the money. I don't care. I'm not buying the house. But I would say in my experience, 20 years, rarely ever happens. And that's because most of my buyers have kept their contingencies in place, that if something happened, they have that back out clause. So just make sure when you're buying a home, you understand this process, understand what you're signing so that you're not putting yourself at risk. But if you have additional questions about where to start in the home buying process, not really sure, what happens after the pre-approval, where do you go from here? Do me a favor and check out this video here.